Hey everyone, so I finally figured out how to use OBS, so I decided to just go live and basically just give a quick overview of the main systems that I'm working with here so that people can get familiar with them if they haven't heard of any of this stuff yet. But yeah, if not, um, look into these and familiarize yourself with them. But so basically we have spiral dynamics, I guess I'll start with, which essentially has like 7 or 8 levels, if you want to count beige as one. But yeah, it's not exactly that relevant. So basically, if you just think of it as 7 levels, then you can already see how the chakra system and the Kabbalistic tree of life basically um, all fit together perfectly. And then the thing on the left is called the model of hierarchical complexity, which is sort of related to spiral dynamics and like Ken Wilber's work with integral theory or whatever he calls it. So you can look up, if you Google like images of spiral dynamics, you'll see some of Ken Wilber's stuff incorporated with it. But so this is sort of the system that I'm building so that people can understand um, how this works. But basically, if you're familiar with any of these systems by now, hopefully at least spiral dynamics, basically you start at the lower levels and then you build your way up, to higher and higher levels represented by the colors. And if you think of them in terms of like frequencies or wavelengths or something, how I have it depicted here crudely with these various colors, that was the best way I could figure out how to do it. So this is just sort of a rough draft to, give people an overview of these ideas, but you can see how the different levels, like red to turquoise, have varying frequencies or wavelengths or whatever. And then, like it says on the right, less energy to more energy. So basically, to evolve or move up through the levels of the spiral, you can think of it as like increasing. You have to put more energy, like more time and attention, researching and everything like that into each level. Basically, like spend the necessary time, like building a foundation in each level and working your way through each of them, which is a process that takes, generally years for most people. I think most people are in blue or orange, and then I know 10% of the population is in green, and like 1% is in yellow. So basically, the vast majority of people are in like blue or orange or some green, generally, which is all in tier 1, which means basically everyone in tier 1 isn't really familiar with much evolutionary or philosophical kind of content like spiral dynamics in these systems, so which are more like yellow tier 2 kind of information. So generally speaking, people in tier 1, like whichever color they're in, like I was saying, the majority of people are in blue, orange, or green. They are not familiar with like evolutionary or developmental psychology, which is what spiral dynamics is, a branch in the field of developmental psychology. So yeah, they're not like compatible pretty much with one another, like the various tier 1 colors or levels. So that's where you get a lot of like the political clashes, and you know, you've been following along with me reading through the book, Spiral Dynamics. There's a lot of examples about how the various colors clash, and you know, they don't understand like the various like quote unquote meme values systems and stuff that each tier or, you know, color, however you want to think of it, represents. So yeah, only when you move to like tier 2 and start taking this kind of stuff seriously, like yellow basically represents like knowledge and learning. Like that's when you start studying this kind of stuff, like systems like spiral dynamics, or like I was saying, developmental psychology or psychology in general. You know, most of the people in tier 1 aren't really familiar with much of that stuff. They might have some like, you know, cursory like pop psychology knowledge or stuff like that, you know, just very like surface level philosophical and, you know, psychological and metaphysical kind of knowledge. Like green kind of represents like new age people and like hippies and stuff, so if you're familiar with that milieu, some of those people, you know, they'll know about like the law of attraction and the law of vibration and stuff, which is like from Hermeticism basically, like the 7 Hermetic principles, at least the law of vibration is. And so yeah, there's a lot of like basically like half-baked kind of spirituality in the like new age, like quote unquote green, you know, milieu or whatever you want to call it. So if you've spent much time in that community, that's like, I used to be centered in green and now I'm more centered in like yellow or turquoise. But yeah, like the next most, basically the 2 most colors I have the most experience with are like green and yellow. Because that's just like where my personal center of gravity is. Like it used to be yellow or green growing up, and then I shifted to yellow about it at like age 20 or something like that. So I basically spent like half my life in green, you know, more or less, and then half my life in yellow with a little bit of like blue and orange and turquoise, you know, mixed in. But so yeah, to move through each of them, you know, I didn't put the like spiral from Spiral Dynamics on here because I just didn't think about it, or it wouldn't fit really. But yeah, if you're familiar with like Jacob's Ladder, from like the William Blake painting, for instance, I forgot to bring that up, but yeah, I don't want to do it now, but you can Google like Jacob's Ladder by William Blake. That's another sort of interesting, you know, parallel with spiral dynamics. You can kind of get an idea of how the, I guess you could call it like consciousness evolves. Like if you think about, like Jesus said in the Bible, the kingdom of heaven is within, then if you think about these as like quote unquote higher and lower like levels, then like the internal, you know, like the kingdom of heaven is within would be like green, yellow, and turquoise, which are the more like, that's the quote unquote spiritual levels. And then, you know, the ones below that are like the physical or material levels. So basically like green and above would be like internal or esoteric, and then you know, orange and below would be like the lower quote unquote levels, or external or exoteric. So yeah, you know, ideally you want to move up through each of the levels is, you know, the basic idea. And so that's basically what I'm trying to promote with this system, is like using, these are like the 4 main systems I've identified that are basically helpful for explaining, you know, how this works. And it's kind of like undeniable. Like I color coordinated like the chakra system with spiral dynamics and the tree of life, because they all like overlap perfectly. And so you can see how just, you know, perfectly everything correlates to each other like that. But you know, which is like the law of correspondence from the 7 hermetic principles. So yeah, basically the idea is to like progress through each of the chakras, and then, you know, you can use spiral dynamics as another tool, or however you put it, to help you to understand like the process of progressing through each of the levels. But the idea basically is that, you know, like you're getting more in touch with your true self, or your soul, so to speak, you know, like in terms of spirituality, as you progress from like green to yellow to turquoise. And then the other ones are more like, you know, like orange and below is more like materialistic and, you know, like I was saying, like externally oriented. So yeah, this is sort of like, I'd say green and above is getting into like esoteric, quote unquote, which is like talking about internal, like Jesus said that the kingdom of heaven is within. So yeah, and that's kind of, you know, you can see the correlation with, if you're familiar with like hippies or the New Age movement and that whole milieu, how like quote unquote green people are, you know, which again is like 10% of the population. But yeah, like they have sort of like intuitive knowledge of this stuff, or like basic knowledge of it, without, you know, most people that are in green like studying it in depth, like and taking it seriously like yellow would. So yeah, it's just kind of an interesting parallel, depending on how familiar you are with like stage green kind of people and that whole vibe. But so yeah, that's like entry level spirituality, I guess I would say, green, or like more like half-baked kind of spirituality, you know, depending on which green, quote unquote, like community you're a part of and stuff. But yeah, if you spend much time around those communities, you'll hear a lot about all this kind of like new agey spirituality versus like yellow, which is kind of like taking it more seriously and doing like an in-depth study of the religions, like on an esoteric kind of level. Because blue is more like exoteric. Like if you were just to read the Bible, like Protestants call it sola scriptura, like they only read the Bible, I guess, and they don't supplement that with anything, and they just take that as like the literal word of God at face value. You know, they take everything literally, and they don't try to like read into anything, or, you know, they don't assume that there's any kind of like esoteric or encoded language that you kind of have to interpret, like the parables, even though it talks about in the New Testament how, you know, there is quote unquote like esoteric or encoded language. Like it, I forget the exact verse off the top of my head, but it talks about like, for you it is meant to know the secrets of the parables, basically, and for them it's not meant to know. You know, alluding to like esoteric knowledge, which would basically be like yellow or turquoise related. Because really, like, the Bible is about turquoise, which is non-duality, and then really, like, any legitimate religious system is talking about, like, basically, quote-unquote, stage turquoise, which is, like, non-duality, or, you know, however you want to phrase that. I think that's pretty much the best word for it. Which is just that everything in existence is just one thing. I mean, it's getting into, like, pretty esoteric, like, metaphysics. Basically, it's idealism in, like, philosophy or metaphysics. But yeah, you can look into, like, quantum mechanics if you're familiar with that. And anyway, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, like, explaining that, but yeah, at the highest levels, so to speak, of, like, philosophy and spirituality, like, stage turquoise is non-duality, basically, which is, like, you know, and if you're not familiar with it, then it's gonna sound, like, really out there, but it's, you know, idealism versus materialism, or basically it's like the idea that spirit or consciousness is the ontological primitive, or the basically the foundation or the fundamental building blocks of reality, relative to, like, matter, which, you know, most people in Western culture are educated to believe that, you know, matter is basically the building blocks of reality, or the ontological primitive, however you want to put it, you know, from the theory of, like, the Big Bang and the theory of evolution and all that good stuff. So, yeah, basically that's just one, you know, philosophical or quote-unquote scientific system that people subscribe to, and then obviously it's a whole thing to get into depending on what level you're at and how much, you know, you've looked into these things on your own. But yeah, the more time you spend in, like, yellow, and again, like, green is 10% of the population, so most people aren't even at green, like 9 out of 10 people, and then yellow is 1%, and then turquoise is like 0.01% or something like that. But basically, yeah, like, what was I gonna say? Yeah, if you believe in the materialist paradigm, then you're probably at, like, stage orange at best, which is 9 out of 10 people, so that makes sense. But yeah, the point being, like, you know, like, the reason I made it, I know it looks really bad with the multicolored, like, wavelengths or frequencies, but I tried to make, like, the lower ones, quote unquote, like, darker, to represent, like, that you're in more, like, ignorance and, like, confusion relative to the higher, you know, basically, like, the higher levels you go up to, the closer your perception of, you know, what's real aligns to, like, reality, so to speak, versus just, like, belief. So it's basically like truth versus belief as you go, like, higher through the levels. Basically analogous to, like, Plato's allegory of the cave, where you know, you have to, like, ascend from, like, the underground cave, or basically, like, the idea that, you know, sort of out of Gnosticism, that, like, the body is, like, you know, encapsulated in ignorance and darkness, and then you have to, like, ascend, you know, to the light, is pretty much the idea. Like, again, that's alluding back to, like, Jacob's Ladder or spiral dynamics, and the whole concept of, like, evolution, or, like, you know, going towards the light, so to speak, which represents, you know, you can just see by, like, the wavelengths. Like, if you think of, like, a dimmer switch, right, and you have it, like, you know, really dim, and then you kind of like slowly turn it up. That would be analogous to like moving through the different frequencies. Like as it goes brighter and brighter, you know, it's more energy, so it's, you know, that's why the light's getting brighter, but it's also, you know, the opposite of that is you're eliminating the darkness as well, right? Like the law of polarity, like darkness is the absence of light, basically, and then, you know, darkness is like analogous to ignorance in like spirituality terms. So the idea is as you progress, you know, through higher and higher levels, you get more knowledge or gnosis or whatever you want to call it. And that's part of the process, especially from like green to turquoise, I'd say, because it's more, you know, once you're getting into like the spiritual side of the spectrum, then, you know, it's basically all knowledge based. Like green, you know, I guess moving to the Kabbalistic tree of life, the green Sephiroth on there is basically, it's called Da'at, which means knowledge. So the little pathway, I guess it's called the path of the flaming sword, but this is the diagram for the Kabbalistic tree of life, like how you're, you know, the little path that you're supposed to follow through it, I guess. I'm not like super familiar with it yet, but anyway, that's like the pattern that you follow as you progress from like the lower to the higher stages on the tree of life. So basically, yeah, as you go from like the orange circle on the right, Hesed, to the green Sephiroth or circle, Da'at, then you're basically, that's the transition from like physical or material to spiritual. And then the green Sephiroth means knowledge. So basically, yeah, like green, and then the two yellows are the trivium. So you have like grammar, logic, and rhetoric, or input, processing, and output, or knowledge, understanding, and wisdom, which is what the name of the actual Sephiroths are. You know, Da'at for the green one means knowledge, Binah means understanding, and then Hokmah means wisdom. So like the actual Trinity is like right there in the green and the yellow Sephiroth. And so, yeah, that's when you transition from like the material to the spiritual, basically. And then, you know, it's all talking about knowledge. I mean, pretty much, I guess if you want to get really technical, you could say the left Sephiroth, Binah, or understanding, is like esoteric knowledge, and then the one on the right, Hokmah, or wisdom, you could say is like mystical knowledge. So basically you have like occult or esoteric knowledge on the left, and then like mystical being / knowledge, I guess, on the right. And then, you know, that ultimately culminates in Keter, the crown chakra, which is basically like enlightenment or non-duality, etc. Or salvation, like salvation in the Bible is talking about enlightenment, you know, because it's just, that's basically their like terminology. You know, each religion just has their own like what would you call that, like flavor or accoutrements, like I don't know what the word is, but like each system, basically, like religious system, you know, whether it's like Christianity, Buddhism, you know, Judaism, Islam, etc., like Hinduism, they each have their own like little, you know, I don't know what the right word for that is, like just, I don't know, system for, depending on what culture, I guess, like, resonates with the people. They're all slightly different, and they have, like, slightly different terminology for talking about these things. Like in Buddhism, it's called nirvana, and Hinduism, it's called moksha, and then it would be salvation in Christianity, or enlightenment, is a pretty common term. But it's all talking about the same thing, which is basically like non-dual consciousness, which is like the objective state of consciousness, in other words, which is like stage turquoise. So you could look into that as well, like in spiral dynamics, stage turquoise. And also, like the Holy Spirit from the Bible is talking about, holy comes from the word holistic, so it's like the holistic spirit or non-duality, etc. So that's what turquoise would be, is the holistic spirit in the Bible. Like it says, God is a spirit, and those that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. So it's talking about turquoise would be spirit, and then truth would be like the left brain, knowledge, the trivium, knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. So you can see how it all fits together pretty perfectly. Yeah, the idea is to progress through all the stages, like using that little, zigzag pattern, like for the Tree of Life at least. And I'm working right now on like describing what you need to be thinking about for each Sephiroth. I'm just still like working on it. But yeah, like hopefully that makes sense, and then you can see how well all the correspondences fit together, and like this helps to sort of like simplify things as much as possible. You can see how on the chakra system, how like the third eye chakra is yellow, and then the crown chakra is turquoise. So it's just another way of describing the same thing. But yeah, once you get to enough energy, so to speak, on like stage yellow, then at least for me, that was when I activated my pineal gland, or my third eye. So yeah, that was pretty much what did it for me. It was like just studying all this kind of like quote unquote esoteric knowledge, or whatever you want to call it, and basically just putting a lot of effort in over the years, trying to understand it all and put it all together in my mind, like using the trivium of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, or knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. And yeah, eventually, after about like a decade of pursuing like enlightenment, quote unquote, I was able to activate my pineal gland, or my third eye. And so that just helps me, to, I don't know, like draw all these parallels and correlations. Like in Hermeticism, there's the law of correspondence, which is like the second law under the law of mentals, which again actually corresponds to like the idea of non-duality, or stage turquoise. If you look into the 7 Hermetic principles, the first one is the law of mentalism, like all is mind. And then, you can relate that to like the findings of quantum mechanics, if you're, depending on how familiar you are with these ideas. But that's what it's, this is like the true metaphysics, or science, or however you want to put it, like when you move beyond like orange, which is like the more Newtonian, like outdated paradigm from like hundreds of years ago. And then like even quantum mechanics is like 120 years old at this point. So like, it's not like this hasn't been known for that long, depending on if you're, in the right circles or not. But, now with the internet, like anyone can research quantum mechanics, and, I found out about it like, I don't know how long ago, but, over a decade ago, and I've been trying to like piece together what it all means ever since then. And that's kind of what led me into this like deep spirituality and esotericism and occultism and mysticism research, but from like a biblical perspective as well. So, I started out with a good foundation in blue after studying the Bible for a few years, and then that's when I kind of, because I was raised atheist, so I didn't have like any, and basically like as a materialist, so I never had any religious upbringing, and basically when I transitioned from like green to yellow around like 20 years old, I decided to, part of that was I went back and like studied the Bible in depth, like, stage blue basically, and like exoteric quote unquote religion versus esoteric, which would be like green and above. So I started out from an exoteric perspective, and then like naturally, since I'm like, now I'm, for the last, decade plus, I've been like centered in stage yellow, which is like all about knowledge and stuff like that. It's literally the understanding and wisdom stages in the trivium, and then green would be knowledge, basically. So for at least the last decade or more, I've been centered in like stage yellow, studying all this stuff, more or less, and pursuing enlightenment. And so basically I started out from like a biblical perspective, like from stage blue, getting into all this stuff, and then progressed to stage turquoise. And a lot of the way I did that was using the system of the fourth way by George Gurdjieff, and like the book is by P.D. Ouspensky, basically like codifying Gurdjieff's system into like one formal book like that. So if you're, I would recommend it to anyone, but if you're interested in this stuff especially, and you want like a legit system to pursue like the highest levels of consciousness, then check out the Fourth Way system by Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, and they have other pupils and stuff. That's on my main channel, like the Fourth Way by Maurice Nicoll. That's another, or not the Fourth Way, the New Man by Maurice Nicoll, and then like Vernon Howard is another person that basically like I don't know what you call it, like led the Fourth Way movement like after Gurdjieff died. So you have like Vernon Howard has a lot of like lectures, or whatever you call it, like sermons that are recorded before he died. So you can actually listen to like his interpretation of that system. And so that's what I did to get enlightened, and that's what I would recommend people do. It would be to study the Fourth Way. From a Christian perspective, like study the Bible. I recommend the King James Version. Then study the Fourth Way the book is by P.D. Ouspensky, but it's really Gurdjieff's system. And then, familiarize yourself with their stuff, and then check out Vernon Howard's lectures, and then he also has like books as well. But he was the next, like Gurdjieff died in like 1950, I think, somewhere around there, and then basically Vernon Howard like took up the mantle or whatever after him, and was like the leading teacher of the Fourth Way after that, and which is basically esoteric Christianity, the Fourth Way. So it's like interpreting the Bible from like a yellow and turquoise perspective relative to like blue, like exoteric. It's more like esoteric versus exoteric, hence esoteric Christianity. But there's also like Rosicrucianism with like Rudolf Steiner and Max Heindel, which is really good if you're interested in like esoteric Christianity. And then there's other like systems like, you know, Hermeticism and Gnosticism and alchemy and Kabbalah and Freemasonry and all that stuff. But anyway, yeah, I recommend The Fourth Way and, you know, the book, and then Vernon Howard's lectures if you really want to just get to like the core of esoteric Christianity and like, you know, again, like more energy, meaning that you have to invest like time and attention, basically, or energy, in other words, into like actually studying these things. And like, again, like Jesus says in the Bible, the kingdom of heaven is within. So, you know, if you haven't transitioned from like orange to green or green to yellow yet, then like basically orange to green is going from like externally oriented, or like the quote unquote lower levels, to like internal or esoteric, which is obviously like the highest levels. And again, like I was saying, like green and yellow, like on the Tree of Life, are literally the trivium. So, you know, look into that system if you're not familiar with that. And then there's also the quadrivium, which I think fits in pretty much right alongside that or below it. So if you're not familiar with like the quadrivium system, you can look into what that's all about. But that was like the classical world's like education system, the trivium and quadrivium. So yeah, this is all like ancient, like esoteric knowledge that took me like a decade to, you know, plus to find, you know, to like uncover it all. That's what like grammar is all about in the trivium, like just scouring the internet and books and whatnot and people for like available relevant information, and then like, you know, understanding or processing, like putting it all together, like connecting the dots. And then wisdom is like applying it to your life, basically. And so yeah, I'm just trying to like help people save a ton of time that I invested into like researching all this stuff to figure it all out, to then you know, hopefully save you a lot of trouble, you know, so you don't have to go through that process. But yeah, basically I've done like a lot of the groundwork for people so they can just, like I said, take my advice or whatever you want to call it, suggestions that I'm trying to give people, such as like, you know, study the Bible, and then, I mean, I obviously did this from a Christian perspective, and then study the, Fourth Way, and, you know, listen to Vernon Howard's lectures, and then that alone, like, you can't really interpret the Bible, I don't think, unless you go through this, like, correctly, unless you go through this process, because, you know, like, unless I or somebody with a lot of, like, background knowledge were to, like, interpret the Bible, they're probably not going to come out with, like, the same quality of information, so to speak, as, like, someone who has, like, knowledge of esoteric Christianity or esotericism and mysticism in general, which is, like, yellow and turquoise knowledge. So, yeah, basically, like, you know, the problem is there's, like, a connection between blue and turquoise. Like, basically the Bible, the people that wrote the Bible were writing it from, like, a turquoise perspective, but unless you're, like, you know, highly intellectual and, like, into these topics, then you're not probably developed, you know, intellectually enough, or spiritually, whatever you want to call it, to really be able to make sense of what the Bible's talking about, you know, unless you take it, like, really seriously and, like, progress to, like, yellow and turquoise. So basically, yeah, like, most people, you know, like, exoteric, quote unquote, like, Christians or people going to church and stuff that don't I mean, there's a statistic like 85% of people that go to church, that call themselves Christians, don't read the Bible. And then, like, I'm pretty sure, like, I forget what percentage, but, like, most of them only read the New Testament. So, like, basically, 9 out of 10 Christians, like, don't even read the Bible anyway. So it's like, like, they don't even read the Bible. Then the people, like, no one in the church really knows what it's talking about. It's just, like, kind of like a social group kind of thing, more or less. Unless you, like, take the stuff seriously and go to, like, maybe, like, an Eastern Orthodox church or something like that, and then, actually read the Bible at least and, like, study this stuff on your own. But, yeah, anyway, that's what I recommend, is either the Fourth Way, which is what I personally used, or, like, Rosicrucianism via, like, Rudolf Steiner. If you want to look into esoteric Christianity, that's another, like, good system, I guess. I'm just not as familiar with it. And it gets, like, I mean, the Fourth Way is pretty simple. Like, it's called the Fourth Way because it's, they called it that after it being the fourth way, quote unquote, to enlightenment, after the first 3 traditional ways, which are the fakir, which is the way of the body, the monk or the priest, which is the way of the emotions, and then the yogi, which is the way of the mind. And so, yeah, you could say that kind of corresponds to this. I guess, like, green would sort of correspond to the emotions. I would say, like, / like, the soul. And then yellow is more like the mind, or, like, the left brain. And then turquoise would ultimately be, like, the right brain, and right, like, left / right brain hemisphere, like, balance. And so, yeah, basically, like, again, green and above is talking about spirituality. So, you could, like, traditionally, I guess, like, green would correspond to, like, the soul, or, like, the emotions, and then yellow is, like, the left brain, and then I guess turquoise is, like, the right brain, basically. And then orange and below would be, like, people that are, like, solely in the left brain. And, like, at least in most men, they don't really have access to the right hemisphere of their brain, or, like, their quote-unquote, like, emotional side, so to speak. So, yeah, like, that's probably where most, like, men, at least, are, only go so far as, like, stage orange, because, just generally speaking, again, like, green, like, the whole hippie milieu is only, like, 10% of the population, so, it's basically, like, 50-50, like, men and women, but, that means, like, only 5% of guys are, at, like, stage green or higher, because I guess women have, like, more balanced hemispheres of their brain naturally, but most men are, like, gonna be in the left hemisphere of their brain only, unless you're raised, like, with some kind of, like, musical, background, or, like, you're left-handed or something like that, then more than likely, I guess, like, 95% of men would be in, like, stage orange or below, probably, because more than likely your right hemisphere of your brain and the whole, like, emotional, like, kind of quote-unquote system in that respect, or, like, the, like, sacred or divine feminine, quote-unquote, which is basically, like, the right hemisphere of the brain, is gonna be, like, atrophied in 95% of men, unless they're into, like, spirituality and this kind of stuff, like, in some regard. But, I guess, yeah, while I'm kind of touching on the subject, I'd say, like, as far as, like, ways to progress through, like, orange to green, I think one thing that I associate, at least, heavily with green would be, like, marijuana, I guess, or, just basic, like, stuff like that, I think you could correlate like yellow to like mushrooms or LSD, you know, like basically like not too crazy of like psychedelics, like ayahuasca or DMT or something like that. I've never done those, but yeah, like I've done magic mushrooms, you know, like psilocybin, cubensis or whatever it's called, and LSD. So I'd say those correspond to like stage yellow. I think, you know, that'll give you like a preview of what that sort of consciousness is like if you're like in like orange or below. And then I think like marijuana corresponds pretty well with like stage green. And then if you think about it too, like when you light like the physical matter itself, like if you think of like alchemical terms of like marijuana, for instance, like you light that on fire to produce like smoke, or in other words, like spirit, right? Like considering that green, stage green is entering into like the more spiritual stages. So yeah, I'm not like advocating any of that stuff. You know, do your own research and, you know, etc. But I would say, in my experience, there's a correlation if you never tried it, and it's at least will give you like a preview of, you know, opening up to these higher levels. And then I guess I could say like, I've never tried it, but I'd imagine DMT or something like really potent like that would correspond to like stage turquoise. So basically like, yeah, that's why, you know, most people aren't going to have experience with these things, and they're more like abstract and, I don't know, like, I guess 1% of the population is at stage yellow, so, you know, that's probably more or less the same amount of people that have tried, like, you know, LSD or mushrooms. Like, it's not a huge percentage of the population, I would imagine, but, yeah, anyway, from my own experience, I would suggest that those, you know, there's some correlation there. So if you're interested in, you know, progressing or evolving, or whatever you're going to put it, from like orange to green, like, or, you know, green to yellow, I would advocate those, or at least, you know, consider it, or, you know, look into them or whatever. But yeah, anyway, then the other system besides that would be the model of hierarchical complexity, which is like, again, I think I mentioned that it's like related to Ken Wilber's work, and it's basically like, you know, corresponds to like spiral dynamics in their system, and then it's related to like Ken Wilber's stuff with integral, and then like metamodernism. I think that's where I found out about it. It was either through the metamodernism people or like Ken Wilber's stuff. But either way, they're all like pretty similar and like related. But yeah, I'm not too familiar with the model of hierarchical complexity. You can look it up on Wikipedia, and it's pretty interesting. But yeah, it's just like another system that corresponds to this. So just to show, you know, it's another way of thinking about it. I think it's kind of helpful because, you know, just like you have the frequencies, like if you look on the right on the spiral dynamics part with like the different levels and how they're color coded, basically the idea is like as you progress through each level, or like, you know, evolve up the spiral, however you're going to put it, or the tree of life, etc. Like you're basically, you know, you have to invest like more energy into like thinking about these things, and like, you know, studying and researching and all that. And so if you think of this like diagram in terms of what you're doing basically with like the model of hierarchical complexity, then you can sort of see how like, you know, they fit together. in that, the more, like, basically there's a lot of things, you can almost think of each of them, I mean, they're pretty oversimplified, but as like a book that you study or something, and how, like, as you progress into higher and higher levels of knowledge and understanding, like, you're just putting more wisdom, you're accumulating, like, more, like, objective knowledge, or, like, gnosis, basically, and creating, like, a more complex or, like, sophisticated worldview relative to, like, the quote-unquote lower stages or levels. So that's where you get the idea of, like, more information. I mean, you can see even, like, wavelength wise how, like, as you put more effort in, like, to progress through the levels, basically, like, you're accumulating, you could even, however you want to think of it, like, you can see how it would work, right? Like, to progress to higher and higher levels, by putting in more energy, or, in other words, investing, like, more time and attention into, like, thinking about these things. And again, there's, like, two aspects to our being, which is knowledge and being. So basically, like, as you're developing, like, wherever you're at in life, on the spiral, or, just in general, you're always developing, like, simultaneously on the level of, like, knowledge, or, like, education, and being, or, like discipline, I guess you could think of it as. And so, yeah, like, that is also, like, everyone's at various levels of development in regards to that as well. So you could think of it, like, Gurdjieff describes the levels of development as, like, the differences between people as being the differences between, like, minerals, plants, animals, and, like, men, and then you could even say, like, gods or something. And then, depending on, that kind of is another analogy for, like, the levels on the spiral or something, like, depending on where you're at, like, there's that much of a difference in, like, the quality of, life, and, like, the sophistication, so to speak, of your consciousness at each level. So basically, like, what was I gonna say? Like, yeah, I mean, the idea is pretty obvious. You want to, like, progress through the levels up to, like, the highest level, and it's not like a competition or anything, but it's like, it's basically teleology, if you're familiar with that concept, like, the idea that, like, an acorn is supposed to, like, grow into an oak tree, in other words. Like, Jesus says, like, if you have faith as a mustard seed, I forget how it goes, but yeah, look up that verse about, like, having faith as a mustard seed in, like, the kingdom of heaven. But basically, this is what it's talking about, is, like, as you progress up the tree of life, it's like basically like a inner alchemy, like an alchemical transformation, like, of turning lead into gold, or, like, water into wine. Like, this is what those analogies are talking about, rather than, like, exoteric, like, actually turning lead into gold or water into wine. Like, it's a hidden esoteric meaning of, and this is basically what it's talking about. And so, yeah, I just wanted to, like, break that down for people. But basically, 99% of people or whatever are in, like, the tier 1 levels, and, like, the whole problem with the world is that the levels, most people are just in whatever level they're in, and they're not really, like, aware or familiar with this model, obviously, of spiral dynamics, or the idea that like people are in different levels of like development, or like, you know, have different value systems, or however you want to put it, or in other words, like different levels of like knowledge and being, and or like education and discipline or will or whatever, skills, however you want to think of it. And so, yeah, like until you get to like tier 2, where you can really, you know, see all the levels for what they are, and how like, you know, certain people are just at certain levels basically, and you know, that's just where they're at in their development. Then, you know, once you get to tier 2, then you understand, like, you know, you don't fight with everyone, because you just understand, like, everyone's where they're at, and ideally you want to help people, like, progress through the levels. If you can, like, explain this stuff to them, then, you know, if they're open to, like, learning and stuff, then, you know, the good thing to do would be to, like, educate people about these systems, to, like, help them become aware of where they're at, and, like, on the spiral, and so they can help, you know, facilitate their progression to the next level. But basically, yeah, and then there's the whole idea of like the map is not the territory as well. So it's like, basically the idea is like you want to use this as a map, and like identify where you're at, and like people around you and stuff like that, if you have like friends that you think would be interested in this stuff, and then, you know, try and help them as well, or, you know, they help each other or something, I guess. But basically, like, you could, you know, use this as like a map to identify where you're at, and then like where you're going, obviously, which would hopefully be like progressing up through the levels. And then you could look into these various systems, you know, to like familiarize yourself with them. You know, again, coming back to this idea of like, you know, yellow, and like acquiring more and more knowledge, but then also like not from like the left brain only perspective, which is another problem that people have. Like, you want to balance this. You can't just like look into stuff that you're only interested in. Like, you have to remain objective. So the thing is, like, you know, you can't really like skip the like spiritual aspect of like what stage green is supposed to be about. And some people will just go from like orange to yellow, I guess, without spending time in green. And then, you know, if you're not familiar with that whole milieu, or, you know, whatever, you'll skip over like the right brain and like spiritual aspect of things. And then you can just get lost in like yellow from like a, you know, orange, like slash materialistic, or, you know, from that, approaching like philosophy and stuff from that paradigm. And then that also is problematic, because, you know, like the left brain, if you're not like connected to reality and you're just reading and studying stuff, then, you know, the left brain can get wildly like out of touch with reality, because it can just get lost in its own like models and theories and stuff if it's not like grounded in objective reality. And, you know, that's where you get like left brain imbalance, if you aren't like, you know, if you're like, most men, obviously, like I was saying, are going to be in stage like blue and orange. Like 95% of men are not going to be at stage green. So, because men are just naturally left brain imbalanced, whereas women apparently have like the hemispheres more balanced, like naturally or whatever. So that's a lot of the problem with the world, I think. And, you know, the thing is, like, if you just skip, you know, if you're like hyper intellectual or something, and you skip over green, you know, you just go from like orange to yellow, then that's also problematic, because then you're just like, it's like confirmation bias. You're just looking into your own, like, things that interest you or whatever that don't necessarily, like, apply to, a balanced approach to life or, like, objective reality, which is basically, just can become problematic. So these are basically just like pitfalls that I'm trying to point out to people that, to help them not fall into these traps, or however you're going to put it. But yeah, like the tier 1 problem is that all the different levels and colors aren't familiar with each other, or they don't understand like the other person's perspective. They can't like empathize with them, in other words, because they're just locked into their like level, and they think that's like all there is, and it's the best, and everyone else is wrong or stupid or whatever. And they can't like differentiate or step up. That's the problem with these like paradigms or levels like this, is that you can't really like step outside of them unless you've like experienced a bunch of different ones, which is sort of how I figured out how all this works, like, and how it's so applicable to reality, because like, I've interacted with like all the various levels, so, and I've spent a lot of time in each of them, so that helped me to like understand like, where people are at, so to speak, or whatever. But anyway, yeah, that's the main problem, is 90% of people, actually 99% of people are in tier 1, and they don't take knowledge seriously and stuff, because again, you have to turn inward, or like, however you want to put it, like, rather than focusing on like the external world and materialism and consumerism and competition and all this kind of stuff, entertainment, distractions, etc. Like, you have to sort of sacrifice some of that stuff. Like, actually has said, like in the tarot deck, the Temperance card is one of the correspondences with this Sephiroth. So basically, temperance, is like moderation, or like balance, however you're gonna put it. And so, yeah, one of the things, for transitioning from like the materialist kind of side of things to the spiritual side of things is like, you have to like make time for knowledge and understanding and wisdom and like studying this stuff, because it takes a lot of time, obviously. And you have to actually like set aside time to invest into like studying and researching and reading books and stuff like that, relative to like, whatever people do, like watching TV and hanging out with your friends and all that kind of stuff, which is like, tier 1 generally. So yeah, like whatever works, I guess, for people, but I'd recommend like you want to be moving up this, the levels, or up the tree of life, and yeah, these are just some like helpful models or systems that you can familiarize yourself with, and ideally you would look into all of them. Like, it's not that big of a deal, but yeah, I'm still sort of like obviously working my way through the Spiral Dynamics book, and like, centered in that mainly for now. But yeah, next I kind of want to look into like the Tree of Life in more detail, and then like the chakras also. So yeah, that's what I'm sort of working on now, is like little basic like primer for people to move through the Tree of Life, based off of like my research for like the past like decade or more, of like stuff that you should be familiar with, I guess, to like, I don't know, it's just kind of like a helpful like map, like I was saying, to help guide people through their progression of the levels or whatever. And yeah, you can just see how well they all like correspond to each other, and I don't know, it's really helpful to know about this stuff. Like, it's helped me in my progression, and basically, yeah, like, I don't know, this is what, like, if you're familiar with the concept of teleology, like, this is basically like what you're supposed to be like doing with your life, quote unquote. It's like progressing through these stages. Because again, there's the idea of like evolution and like involution, which would be like going down, and like stagnation would just be like staying in the same level like for your whole life, pretty much. And so, yeah, I'm just trying to help make people aware, because again, 99% of people are in tier 1, so they don't, they're not familiar with like spiral dynamics probably, or like any of this stuff, or esoteric knowledge in general, whatever. So I'm just trying to make this stuff more accessible to people, and like help them to like understand, where they're at, and that there's like systems like this that you can use to like progress through like different like modalities of consciousness, so to speak. And yeah, basically the idea is like, ideally you want to like progress to higher and higher levels, especially if you're someone that's into like personal development or spirituality and that kind of stuff. So yeah, this is like how it works, and the objective, way of going about doing this. So yeah, I'm kind of working on a little like tree of life thing where, I'm gonna like put little points for what I think people should think about, for each of the like stages along the Sephiroth, along, their progression up the tree or the spiral, however you want to put it, through the levels. And yeah, I don't know, like basically just help like illuminate the path for people, so that they can help see where they're at more clearly, and then like the next things that they should be like studying or looking into or doing or whatever. But yeah, basically like check these things out and familiarize yourselves with them, like especially this system, spiral dynamics is like the most accurate, or most I don't know how you put it, like modern like system that's gonna be like accessible and make sense to most people. But you can like read the book or watch videos on it, and then once you're familiar with spiral dynamics, then you can like start looking into these also. And yeah, they all correspond to each other really well, and if you look into them all, then it'll help you understand like what you're essentially doing by like progressing through each of these, like more or less. And so anyway, yeah, like I said, I'm working on a more detailed version of the Tree of Life using this system. So if you're familiar with these, and then once I'm done with this other little system that I'm working on, then when you put it all together, once you understand where I'm coming from with all this stuff, then it should be a pretty helpful like guide as far as how to follow this path of progression or whatever, and to help people identify where they're at. So anyway, hopefully that was interesting to people and you enjoyed that. Yeah, I'm going to keep working on elaborating these theories better and better. This is just sort of like a outline of the main systems that I'm working with, I guess. And basically, you know, as I get more comfortable and familiar about describing these things, then I'll put more and more effort into like, you know, better like graphics and diagrams and stuff like that. But I just thought it was neat how these all fit together like perfectly like this, pretty much. And you know, I just wanted to do like a quick overview of what I think the most important systems people should familiarize themselves with are. And again, this will apply to like pretty much any spiritual or psychological system that you're working with. So it's like, you know, it applies to like religion, like whether you're a Christian or whatever religious system you're approaching this from, or like psychology, or I mean, you know, I'm not sure what other things apply, philosophy, I guess. But anyway, yeah, it's just pretty cool how this works. Like, spiral dynamics is a really good system in and of itself, and then like how well it corresponds with these other systems. Like, you can see there's some like intrinsic thing in creation or nature, however you want to put it, that, you know, there's something to this stuff, and like, you know, how it all fits together perfectly like this, and then progressing through these stages and stuff. So, yeah, to me, like, it's pretty obvious, and I mean, I've progressed through all the stages myself, so I know that this is how it works, like, consciousness, however you want to put it. But, yeah, for people that are interested in, like, spirituality and religion and enlightenment and all that kind of stuff, like esotericism, mysticism, then, yeah, like, this is legit the pattern that you want to follow. And I'm just trying to make it like, you know, simplify things for people so they don't have to put in like, you know, thousands of hours of researching everything like I did. Hopefully make, you know, this stuff more accessible to people and more enjoyable to, you know, learn about this stuff. Because that's the thing, if like, that's what I'm trying to do, is make it simple for everyone, so I can save you like tons of time and stuff by just telling you exactly like the good stuff to look into. And then, yeah, for the people that actually follow through, like, I think you'll see the benefits in your life and how, you know, this stuff's pretty interesting and like can actually affect your life and, you know, the quality of your life and your happiness and your level of intelligence and awareness and all that stuff. So it's basically no downside to studying this, and, you know, it can have like a massively positive impact on your life if you take it seriously. And so that's why I'm trying to make it, you know, accessible for people and simplifying it as much as I can to make it, you know, just easier for people to, you know, identify where they're at and, you know, the people around them and stuff like that, and then how to progress, you know, through each level, basically. So hopefully that makes sense and people enjoyed that. Thanks for watching, and yeah, have a good one. Take care.